All right, we're going to start out class with some cell drawing. First, going to think about concentration gradients, chemical driving forces, and then we're going to continue into our continued discussion on chemical driving force, electrical driving force, and electrochemical driving force. Sure. And probably if I have you turn one in, I'll probably just have you like take a picture of it either now or at home. Send it to me. I'm not big on collecting paper if I can avoid it.
You know, there's an update on the textbook.
I don't, but I got them the course IDs, and they said something about an extension on mastering. Have you guys tried logging in recently?
As of right now, our temporary access.
It's still stalled. Okay. I'll check in on that again this afternoon. Hopefully it'll be sorted today, so you guys have some time to study for that. I'm going to start just drawing alongside you guys. So who wants to remind me where the ECF would be on this diagram? What's our ECF? Part of why we're doing this is to remember all these abbreviations that can get kind of confusing. Yeah, so that's going to be outside the cell, right? Our ECF is outside the cell. Thing we're not confusing this with is our electrochemical driving force, or electrical driving force, which are our ECDF and our EDF. We'll be talking about more today. We have our ICF, or intracellular fluid inside. All right, we drew some solutes. Okay, we know we have a chemical driving force that's pointing outward, meaning our solutes have to be higher concentration inside than outside, right? Because they're always going downhill from high concentration to low concentration. This is our CDF. So a thing to note here about the chemical driving force, I'm just going to say it because I don't know how to phrase this as a question. So a thing that you should know about the chemical driving force is that it's going to be specific to molecules. when we look at our electrical driving force, lots of different things add into that membrane potential, right? You add together how many anions, cations, and so on. So those would act on any ion, whereas here the chemical driving force may be specific to that molecule. Okay. So in this picture, we have a chemical driving force, but let's say we notice that our solute isn't flowing down the chemical gradient. What are some possibilities for this? Tell me a situation in which you think the CDF wouldn't direct our movement of our solute. Right. So if we have an EDF that points in, let's say our solute is an ion, right? So if the EDF is more powerful, which direction is that solute going to flow, that ion now we're talking about? It's going to flow in, right, if it's more powerful, right? Or we could have another situation, right? What's another time point, or what's another situation in which we wouldn't have solutes flowing out of the cell here? Any other reasons we might not have movement? I can think of like two more. So one of the reasons we might not have movement could relate to transport, right? If we don't have any transporters, this was one of my other reasons, right? The second reason is if we don't have proteins embedded that allow that molecule to travel, right? If you don't have any ion channels open, so here's my channel, I'm gonna close it, right? Doesn't matter if you have these driving forces, if we don't have any way for this ion to get through the membrane. And then another possibility might be, right, say we're at our equilibrium potential. So back to the EDF, right? The EDF could be the same size as the CDF, in which case, would we see movement of that ion if they're the same size? Well, Monday. No, right? Yeah, the equilibrium potential, right? So we'd know, like they were talking about sodium. So we'd have our equilibrium potential of sodium. If we're at that equilibrium potential, by definition, equilibrium means that we have no net movement. And the situation that would create that is if these two forces are equal but in opposite directions. We have a lot of factors to consider as we're thinking about whether something will move and which direction it will move in. I have a couple examples to practice this. So what this notation at the top means, right, we're just noting the concentration inside versus outside. So that's the stuff at the top, right? So this is just labeling the concentration in millimoles instead of drawing solutes, right? And then we have at the bottom our membrane potential. So that's our VM. So that's how we're reading this diagram. So the steps we want to be taking here, reminder, we want to think about the chemical gradient, figure out what direction that's going, so what direction our chemical driving force is. We want to think about that ion specifically. So here we're thinking about sodium. We want to think about whether that electrical driving force is into or out of the cell. And then we can try and sum them together in our mind to think about whether we're overall going to move in or out. Take like another 30 seconds, and whoever's not answered, I'll assume you're just waiting for us to help. Okay, great. So what we should note here, right? The way we did this is we noted these two concentrations are equal. So there is no chemical driving force here because we are at equilibrium for the concentration of the solute, right? There's no higher and lower, so we can't move downhill. There's no gradient. So the only thing that would matter here is our electrical driving force. And we note that inside the cell, we have this positive charge. Sodium has a positive charge on it, so it's repelled out of the cell. So our electrical driving force is out. We have no chemical driving force. CDF equals 0. So we're going to go out. Try another one. Think about potassium, another cation, another positively charged ion. The number of devices we have today. Okay. So, oh, no, we got a couple more coming in. So what we're doing here, right? We're picking the directions of our two forces, right? So which direction is our chemical driving force, out or in? Yep, CDF is out. CDF. All right. What about our electrical driving force? What direction is that? Great. Yeah, so they're in agreement. They're pointing the same way, which means when we add them together, they just get bigger. Nothing switches direction here. So overall, awesome. Overall, we're going to go out. Yep.
The electrical driving force is going out because the potassium is coming
Exactly. So just like for the sodium, they're repelling that positive charge. Okay. And let's switch it up and look at an anion. Okay. Kind of the opposite of that first one, right? So we have our CDF pointing in. Right now, we have no EDF, right, because we're at 0 millivolts. So this is neither attracting nor repelling that chloride ion. So we're going to go in because we only have a CDF. So overall, we're going to go in. But as we start to talk about the electrochemical gradient and the electrochemical driving force, sometimes we'll be thinking about these forces in this way, and sometimes we'll be back solving, and we'll know from the electrochemical driving force whether an ion is going in and out, and we'll have to use that knowledge to kind of solve backwards and figure out which direction the chemical and electrical driving forces are pointing. So when we left off, we were talking about the equilibrium potential. So the equilibrium potential is a type of membrane potential where the electrical force and the chemical force are equal and in opposite directions. So we abbreviate that, and this slide is a little bit unclear about, right? So Vm here is our membrane potential, but when we specify an equilibrium potential, we're going to specify it with an E, and then we're going to say some ion at the bottom. So we could have E and A, we could have E, K, we have E, C, L, and it's going to tell us about that specific ion because they will both, or all of these would be affected by the membrane potential, right, by those positive and negative, but they're going to have different sodium concentrations inside and outside the cell than we have potassium concentrations, for example. So when we're thinking equilibrium potential, because this is talking about both the chemical and the electrical force, we need to be specific about which ion we're talking about because we're summing these two forces together. So when we are at our equilibrium potential, what we would notice about these two numbers, when we're at our equilibrium potential, we're not at a Vm of 0, right? That's not what our equilibrium potential means. That's the situation where we would have 0 electrical force. What we're doing when we're at our equilibrium potential is, say we're talking about sodium, right? So our equilibrium potential of sodium would be our membrane potential, so they'd match. So it would be like our current situation matches this equilibrium potential. So we can see that's the case here for potassium in our image. Right? Our equilibrium potential, potassium is negative 94 millivolts. And the current situation, the current membrane potential is negative 94 millivolts. That's fundamentally what that means, what that equilibrium potential means. Telling you the membrane potential at which this situation is true, where the chemical driving force and electrical driving force directly oppose each other. find it helpful to really kind of internalize this fact. So kind of sit with it, mull over it, think about it a bunch, because when you get a gut feeling for this one fact, you'll notice that as we start to talk about the electrochemical driving force, we're really going to be just trying to get to this point. We're going to be trying to get to the membrane potential that is our equilibrium potential, right? So when I think about the electrochemical driving force, I kind of think about the fact that the ion just wants to move in whatever direction will get it closer to that membrane potential that it's looking for, right? It's just going to move whatever direction, plus or minus, in or out, that'll get it to this membrane potential. So by knowing the equilibrium potential and the membrane potential, so what the charge difference is at the current moment versus what that ion wants the charge difference to be, we can solve which way the ion is going to go without actually knowing anything about the chemical driving force or the electrical driving force specifically. Just those two numbers, EK and VM, could tell us what's going to happen with our potassium ion. So your book talks about it, and you could chart it out this way, thinking about when VM is weaker versus when VM is stronger. I would like to propose to you, right? So if we have EK at negative 94, our equilibrium potential, potassium at 94, and we know potassium is a positive ion. Okay. We're starting at negative 70. Now it says it on the slide, but what would you have to do with a positive ion to get from negative 70 to negative 94? Would you have to put more positive ions into the cell or out of the cell? Yeah, they have to go out, right? So this is kind of what you want to be internalizing here, right? So like, say that VM of negative 70, right? It's made up of a bunch of anions, right? A bunch of negative ions. But we also have some cations mixed in, right? There are just more anions giving us that negative 70, right? So as we have positive ions, those cat ions, those potassium ions, in this case, leaving, nothing is happening to the anions, so they're kind of like shining through, right? This makes the cell more negative when those positive ions leave, right? So as we have more and more potassium leaving the cell, we get closer and closer to this negative 94. So that's what it really means, kind of, about the membrane potential being weaker than the equilibrium potential. What it's saying is that we're trying to go like towards this bigger number. All right, so the opposite here, the bigger number here, is the membrane potential. That's what it's referring to as stronger, but we can kind of think about it just in that same direct way of like, which direction does it want to go, right? So here we're talking about a cell, again, has a bunch of negative charges. So we're at negative 100. Got some positive charges as well, of course. And then the same thing is kind of true outside the cell. We're going to put our membrane on, right? We have some negative charges. Some positive charges. Right, because we're thinking about charge separation here. So in order to go from negative 100 to negative 94, what would need to happen here? What kind of movement would get us to negative 94? Say we're thinking movement of these cations because we're thinking about potassium. Would more or less potassium ions inside the cell get us to negative 94? Yep, we're trying to make this number more positive, right? So we need to move those in to get to negative 94. Next time we see this, we'll try drawing a flow chart too, just in case thinking about it this way isn't helpful for you. But I like thinking about it this way, just like what do we need to do to get to that equilibrium potential? Because then there's really almost only one rule you have to remember to figure out what's going on with the electrochemical driving force. You just have to know which direction would get us either more or less positive inside that cell. We're just going to have movement until we reach that number that is the equilibrium potential. Now, once we're looking, or while we're looking at these, I should say, so that's what tells us our electrochemical driving force. That's what these two numbers told us, right? So we know to get our membrane potential to drop down from negative 70 to negative 94, we had to have our potassium ions leave the cell, right? They're positive, so as they leave, it makes the cell more negative. That's our electrochemical driving force. But if we're trying to back solve stuff about our chemical driving force and our electrical driving force, what do you think is easiest to get if we're looking at this equilibrium potential, this membrane potential, and our electrochemical driving force? What do you think our next step of solving this chemical and electrical driving force is going to be? What do you have enough information to figure out? Chemical or electrical? So what we know, right? The things we know potassium is positive, right? We know our VM when we're starting out is negative 70. Okay. What driving force could we figure out from these two factors, chemical or electrical? Yeah, so all we need in order to figure out an electrical driving force is to know what ion we're talking about and its charge, and what the charge inside the cell is, right? Because the electrical driving force is all about attracting or repelling, right? So if we're thinking steps of figuring the stuff out, right? I like to start with 1, find direction of the ECDF using equilibrium potential. Right. Which is our, which way does the ion want to go overall? And then the second step I like to do is figure out the direction of the EDF. So the question we're asking ourselves is, does our membrane potential attract or repel our ion? Okay. And once we know these two things, right? So we know our direction for the electrochemical driving force. Okay. So now that we know our electrical driving force and our electrochemical driving force, right? So we know ECDF is out. and our EDF is in, right? How could we possibly get this situation where our ion is going out, even though our electrical driving force is pointing in? Again, it's on this picture, but what's the only possible explainer for this? Exactly. The only possible way we could have these two things in opposite directions is if we're following the chemical driving force and it's really big. Right? So that would get us the direction of our chemical driving force in this situation. This would be a little bit trickier, right? So in this case, we see that they're going in the same direction, right? So here we know our electrical driving force and our electrochemical driving force are going the same direction. So we might not know necessarily that the chemical driving force is pointing out unless we have information that tells us about those concentration gradients. So it would be going out when they were at equilibrium. Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Okay, that's a good way to solve it. That's a good point. Yeah. So we'll do more practice in the future with the electrochemical driving force and these different directions and forces, because I know this is something that's new to people and can be kind of tricky. But that's kind of the basis for what we're going to be thinking about as we move forward and start to think about transport, and especially as we move into our second unit and think about neurons. Neurons and synapses, all going to be about how we have these charges flowing into and out of our neurons, and which direction they're going to flow to change our membrane potentials. So it's a really important concept. This is one of the main places where I think that if you don't get something from the previous unit, it's going to be really, really hard to follow through into the second unit, even though the exam questions themselves aren't cumulative. This is really core to understanding what's going on. So these are some checkpoint questions for you to practice on. Here are some concentrations. If you wanted to make yourself some practice questions, you might think about what this would do to your chemical driving forces and what situations in which you would have electrical driving forces and electrochemical driving forces pointing in other directions. But we'll do more practice questions in the future. I have one up here. Practice question. Okay. A couple seconds. What we want to note here, right? So this time, we have our equilibrium potential for chloride ions. We have our membrane potential for chloride ions. So looking at these two, we know the cell wants, or chloride wants at least, for the cell to get to negative 61. See, most people answered A. What would happen if we moved chloride ions into the cell? Does membrane potential get more negative or more positive? Yeah. Okay. So if we move chloride ions, do people see why that's true? Right? So if we're at negative 66, right, and say we add a chloride ion, right, it's negative. So now we'd be at like negative 67, right? So every chloride ion we add, we're going down. But what do we note here about our equilibrium potential? Is it more positive or more negative? So what has to happen for the chloride ions to make it more positive? Right, it has to leave, right? So what we want to do, we want to be at negative 66. Instead of adding a chloride ion, right, we want to subtract it, right? So if we have a chloride ion leave, that would put us at negative 65, and so on. I think most people are looking at this concentration gradient. So it's true here that the concentration gradient on here points in, but that's just our CDF. So we need to also look at this equilibrium potential to realize that overall, even though our CDF is in, our electrochemical force, our ECDF, is out. So what would explain this? What other thing could we tell from these two pieces of information? What force are we missing here? The electrical driving force, right? So these are in opposite directions. That must mean that we have our electrochemical driving force somehow explained. All right, so now we're going to move into our discussion of active, passive transport, and the factors that influence basically rates of transport as well. I'll give you a second to pull up this. I think we're into the second packet. At least I have it labeled as the second packet. So we have our objectives. We're thinking about our factors that influence the rate at which substances can move across the membrane. We're thinking about what factors affect how permeable that membrane is. So when we think about rate of transport, I want to make sure we understand this concept of diffusional equilibrium. When we're thinking about equilibrium potential, in that previous packet, we were thinking about the chemical, electrical driving forces, both of them. When we're thinking about diffusional equilibrium, we're just thinking about this situation where we have no net transfer of molecules. And for right now, we're thinking just about chemical concentration, right? So we see chemical concentrations here. We might have some movement in one direction, but if we do, if our concentrations are the same, the direct flow in the other direction will equally balance it. So we'll be at diffusional equilibrium. So usually when we see this, we're just going to say there's no movement of the molecules. Now, in reality, if we think about chemistry, right, we know we're still jiggling around, but there's no net transfer. Simplify it that way. When we are not at equilibrium, we will have net transfer of molecules. We will refer to that as the net flux. So flux is just movement. So our one-way flux is just the movement of the molecules in one direction. Our net flux is the overall movement of the molecules. So really the net flux is kind of what we've been tracking in our previous discussion. I want to remember that term. So we're starting out by thinking about passive transport. The passive transport is just movement that's going to bring us towards that diffusional equilibrium. And the way we can get towards that diffusional equilibrium is by downhill movement down our gradient. So we move from higher concentrations to lower concentrations until our net flux reaches zero. So until we are at diffusional equilibrium. This happens spontaneously because this is kind of just due to statistics and probability and the fact that molecules are moving around all the time. So no energy from the cell is required. This is kind of just a physical property of the universe, right? As we talk about physiology, we are going to categorize different types of passive transport. So all of these types are going to be down our gradients. They're all going to be moving us towards equilibrium. But what we're going to see separates them is how they're moving towards equilibrium. So when I say how, basically mean how are they crossing our membrane. Right? Remember, we have our phospholipid bilayer, right? We've got our polar head, hydrophilic, pointing outside towards the very inside of the cell. We have our hydrophobic region with the fatty acid tail, right? So we know some things cross and some things can't, right? So like ions can't get through that hydrophobic layer, small gases like oxygen could. So our simple diffusion, I'm gonna go through it in the slides, but our simple diffusion is basically going to be directly through the membrane, like right through the phospholipids. Through phospholipids. Our facilitated diffusion, we're going to think about things called carriers. So our carrier or transport proteins. Okay. Or we can have movement through channel proteins, a different type of protein we'll be thinking about. So both of these carrier and channel proteins, we've mentioned very briefly before. What type of proteins were these? We had to categorize them, part of the cell membrane. They were one of our components.
Integrated.
Yeah, there are integral proteins. So for simple diffusion, since we're going directly through the phospholipid bilayer, right, directly through, we don't need any membrane proteins. We can go straight across, nothing blocking them. So only certain things can affect the rate then, right? We don't need to think about the presence or absence of proteins in this case, because in simple diffusion, we don't need a protein. So the things that affect the rate of simple diffusion are going to be the magnitude of the driving force, right? So how much does that molecule, that solute, want to escape the cell, or how much is it attracted to the cell, right? That driving force could be a little weak force, or it could be a really big force. That would affect the rate. The bigger the force, the faster those little molecules are going to want to move. Other things that affect the rate are properties of the membrane itself, right? So when we think about membranes, they're all made of the phospholipids, but if we have a lot of surface area, right, when we're thinking about flux, when we're thinking about molecules passing through the membrane, the way that fundamentally happens Their molecules are jiggling around all the time, right? Just like random movement. Just how the universe is. Things are just randomly moving around. When they cross is when they bump into the membrane and just shoot through. So as we increase surface area, as we have more membrane, they're more likely to bump into the membrane. So our membrane surface area is therefore going to affect the rate of transport because it increases the likelihood that our molecules are even going to come up to the membrane in order to cross. Then we can also have variations to membrane permeability. And we'll talk about how that works itself, but just because something can get through doesn't always mean that it's super easy for it to get through. There are some sort of gentle variations there as well. So this is showing that first factor, the magnitude of the driving force. All this says, right? So as our driving force, in this case, our concentration gradient, right, goes up, right, our net flux goes up. Now, anyone know here why our driving force, why this graph only talks about the concentration gradient? What do we remember about what can cross directly through those phospholipids? What kind of molecules? So it's going to be small things, but specifically it's going to be things that are hydrophobic, or sorry, yeah, that are hydrophobic. So non-polar gases, basically. The main one we're going to think about is oxygen, CO2. Okay. So when we're thinking about these molecules that can go through simple diffusion, is there an electrical gradient that affects oxygen? I'm going to tell you no, right? The only time we're thinking really about those electrical gradients, those electrical driving forces, is when we're thinking about ions, right? So it's not like O2 plus, it's not O2 minus, it's just O2, right? That's why it can get across the membrane. That's why it can do simple diffusion. And that means that there's no electrical force on it. So all we have to think about is our chemical driving force, which is our concentration gradient. So that's why there's no electrical driving force here on this diagram, because there's no electrical driving force on a molecule that can cross the membrane by simple diffusion. So here we see some pictures of different membrane areas, right? So you can think about if your molecule dropped on this slide, right? Which slide are you more likely to run into a membrane and potentially cross it? Number 1 or number 2? Yeah, so you can just think about it like a maze, right? Like if you were bopping around here, you're way more likely to cross these membranes because there are more of them. And here we have less surface area, right? So you'd end up going farther before you ran in to some membrane. So as our membrane surface area increases, we see more movement, therefore greater rate of diffusion. So we also said that things that affect membrane permeability can affect the rate of simple diffusion. So it is true that some of our non-polar things that can get through that phospholipid bilayer are going to have different levels of lipid solubility. So this might depend on things like maybe size, something like that. Some things can be lipid soluble, but not that lipid soluble. That's possible. So we can see the second point down here is size and shape, right? So just because it can squeeze through those phospholipids and get directly across doesn't mean it can do it really easy. Temperature would make an effect here as well, because it would affect the fluidity of the membrane and the speed of the molecules moving. But this isn't really relevant in human physiology because what do we know about temperature? What? Yeah, exactly. It's a regulated variable. So this is one of our homeostatically controlled kind of factors. Thickness of the membrane would matter if we're thinking about kind of like a tissue membrane, right? If we're thinking about the layer of cells. So we can kind of expand our idea of diffusion from just a single cell, thinking about a layer of cells, right? So if we're thinking about like the epithelial membrane, say the lining of the lungs, right? At that point, if we increase the thickness of this layer, it's going to slow down things moving across this layer as well. We think about diffusion both for an individual cell, but also kind of through these membrane layers. So we'll pick up with our proteins, our carrier and channel proteins on Wednesday. Let me look at it. So I didn't write a bad example if possible.
Because these have more of a difference than these, so I assume this force would be stronger.
So the difference between these doesn't tell us about like the magnitude of the electrical force. This is just telling us like on net which direction the ion wants to move.
Okay.
So like, right, this was our CDF, but what determines our EDF, our electrical driving force, is how this negative 66 is affecting the charges on the chloride atoms. Right, like remember that this is either repelling or attracting,
Yeah.
right? So it's repelling, right?
Yeah.
So the way we get this equilibrium potential, the reason that's in control is because this is telling you like what these two summed together is. So the fact that they're really close tells you that the electrical driving force honestly isn't that much bigger than this chemical driving force,
Okay.
but it is a little bigger. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Almost. We'll do more practice with these because
Okay,
it's a
good.
tricky concept to internalize.
Yeah.
But what it's saying is that this difference is about the ECDF, which is our sum of forces. It's not the individual force.
Okay.
So this is telling us like is CDF plus EDF, is that a positive or negative number? So all it's telling us is about the sign on this answer.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
A little bit.
that way?
Yeah. I think it's just going to take some more.
Yeah, it takes some time. Yep.
Okay.
So it's just saying positive versus negative.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
So I'm one of the people that don't have the textbooks.
Yeah, let me check what's going on with the master course now.
I just we don't know how to like study because
Okay.
that's a big part of the studying part, but we've never like.
Okay. Yeah. So ways you can study until we get that. Have you done the book problems?
Yeah.
That comes in the book. Yeah, you can make your own flashcards for these
Okay.
things. SI worksheets, I assume you're doing.
Yeah.
Probably you will be set with those things, but I do want to. Just really annoys
Is there
me
like
that they
a
haven't
free
gotten you
text
these.
online that I could go search and find, or
I can try and make one, but it would take me a little bit of time. Yeah. Let's see,
and then on the quiz yesterday, my
Mhm.
computer, I sent you an email. My computer
sorry,
died
yeah.
during that, so I got a 4 out of 9.
Okay.
Any way I can like redo that because it doesn't show my knowledge on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I tried to
Yes,
log
I'll
in
go
on
and
my
reset
phone
that,
when
sorry.
it happened, but it just didn't. Sorry.
I don't remember where it is.
I did try logging in on a different email,
Uh-huh,
and it said it's been past 14 days, so.
okay, I'll have to call them back.
I mean,
No.
at least it's not just me, so I don't.
No,
But
it's still really frustrating. I get that. Okay, so it won't let you make like a different account with a different
No.
email address. Okay. I